Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a fully independent podcast. Lend your support at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube, and stay tuned for some new platforms where you'll also be able to find this podcast very soon. Elijah Magnier is here today, and we talk about the 3 attacks in 1 week on U.S. bases in Iraq, following an announcement that the U.S. will escalate the operation in Iraq. U.S. and NATO troops will no longer be withdrawn from Iraq, but instead will escalate and expand the mission substantially. We talk about Syria, the axis of resistance, and the broader region. And when we recorded this interview a few days ago, the media was reporting that the Biden administration is taking a calm approach, investigating the source of the attacks and not overreacting. All of that changed just yesterday when Biden launched a retaliatory attack on, quote, infrastructure utilized by Iranian-backed militant groups in eastern Syria, unquote. Reports on the multiple target attack are still varying at the moment, but the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights claims that 22 people were killed. The strikes happened in the Abu Gamal area near the border with Iraq, and the, quote, Iranian-backed militant groups, unquote, that the Pentagon spokesman referred to are Iraqi Popular Mobilization Force, PMF fighters. The PMF is sponsored by the Iraqi government and was reorganized around 2014 to fight against ISIS, something that Elijah has explained in previous interviews on this podcast. No evidence from the alleged investigation that the media claimed the Biden administration was conducting before any response has been reported. The Pentagon frames it as a defensive strike and also claims that this was an attempt to, quote, de-escalate the overall situation in both eastern Syria and Iraq, unquote. There's also a bonus question for patrons about U.S. support for Saudi operations in Yemen and an increase in the deployment of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, and on why the American people don't elect leaders who can end the forever wars. We recorded this on February 23rd, 2021. Elijah Magnier is here speaking to us from Europe. Hello, Elijah. Thanks so much for coming back on the show. It's great to see you.
Hello, Joanne. Thank you for having me again.
So today, there's a lot going on because with the Biden administration coming in, NATO is now saying that they're going to increase the amount of American troops in Iraq by 8 times, which I always assume is more. If they're admitting to that much, it's going to be even more. Although I did just see that Kirby guy is back. He used to be the State Department spokesman. I think he might be the Defense Department spokesman now. I actually forget. He claims that there's not going to be any more American troops. It's all going to be other NATO countries. Again, I don't really believe that. But the last time we talked, Elijah, you were explaining how the resistance forces, the various militias inside Iraq, were holding back because there were negotiations going on. There were some troop withdrawals, and they were saying, okay, we'll wait, we'll take you at your word. But if you don't follow through on your agreement, then things are going to change and things are going to heat up. And you were correct that is what happened. And now it appears we've had 3 attacks in the past week on 3 different locations in Iraq, in the Green Zone, the most recent one, I believe. The Al-Balad Air Base was over the weekend, and then last week we had some rockets come into the area around the airport in Erbil. So it seems like things are escalating. To me, it seems obvious that it's because of the NATO announcement. What are you hearing? What do you think?
Well, first of all, as you summarized the situation very well, the Iraqis were waiting for Trump to honor his commitment, which is not something that he's very good at. And he said in November he would withdraw all troops. And then what he did is he reduced the troop to 500, as the Americans are announcing. And then in the last month, everybody was afraid of a possible clash where Trump would capitalize on and stay in power and prevent Biden's nomination. And then the Capitol Hill saved everybody, really. And then everything turned toward the domestic event in the US. And it was understandable that Trump was not looking at what's happening in Syria or in Lebanon or in Iraq or even in Afghanistan. And he's not going to honor his commitment to withdraw from Afghanistan or from Iraq or to lift sanctions on Syria or anything. The Middle East was no longer on his priority, and his concern about what's going to happen to him, that was more on the top list of his most priority things to solve. Now, with Biden, with the arrival of Biden to power, we see that Biden is indeed using exactly everything, all the inheriting of Donald Trump. He's imposing the same sanction by not lifting them. The only thing he did is that he lifted the sanction on the Houthi as individuals to be able to talk to them and not violate the law, which is not something that the American administration is always very concerned about. However, because of the advance of the Houthi in Marib and the gaining of another capital that is essential and oil-rich, then Biden moved to relieve the Houthi individual, but kept the sanction on a country and kept this sanction on oil. And that takes us to Iraq, where Biden is leaving from the door and re-entering from the window, because NATO is the US. And by saying we are raising the number of NATO from 500 to 4,000, that means the major force is the US. The contribution to the other Western country, European and non-European, like Canada, Australia, or whatever, all these countries are just supporting the US presence and doing really what the US wants. However, this is not a decision that the Prime Minister, Mustafa Kazimi, can take, and the consequences on him, already he's not very strong. Well, actually, to tell the truth and to be honest, he is a weak Prime Minister. And this is a decision of the Parliament, and the Parliament would certainly disagree with that and doesn't accept the presence of NATO. And I think NATO will think about not sending the 4,000 troops soon, although it was announced, but I don't think this is going to happen. The Iraqi resistance is determined to impose on the US forces and all foreign forces the departure from Iraq at all costs, and that is not going to change.
Yeah, that confused me because I thought, well, what happened? Did the Iraqi parliament back down? Did something change in the government? Because I painfully watched the whole speech by Stoltenberg. Now, he was pretty uncomfortable giving that speech. And there was a little pushback. There were a couple journalists there who were just, throwing softballs, but there were a couple who pushed back on it. But when he kept saying over and over again, Elijah, this is with the cooperation of the Iraqi authorities, with the cooperation of the Iraqi authorities. And I thought, that doesn't sound like what I've heard from Elijah. So like, what happened? So it was like, you called it a side deal with the prime minister. So what happened? Did our diplomats or our military deal with, what happened?
Well, that's a very good question. Iraq is a bit complicated. If you look at the Iraqi economy, Iraq is in need of 70 to 80 billion dollars. And Iraq is in deep serious economic crisis. And the only salvation of Iraq are the money from the Arab Gulf countries that abide by the US decision and from the IMF. Mm. And both, let's say, the whole Arab entity is a kind of an organization. And we're talking here about the Gulf country that are protected by the US, and they enjoy their presence in power due to the US protection and US military bases. So all these are one entity, and the IMF is another financial institution, and both respond to the US. And without these, Iraq cannot get the billions that it needs to pay the salary of the security forces, of the municipalities, of the employee. There are millions, 5 to 7 million employees in Iraq. There's huge amount of money that the government needs to pay every month. So what's happening is Kazemi is saying, well, I will strike a kind of a balance without scaring the American and saying, you have to leave, but you have to give us money and do everything for us to survive financially. And that Kazemi thinks it is not possible because he understands that relying on the Gulf countries and on the US is essential. The Iraqi resistance is saying, well, we have China, and you made already deal with China for $20 billion on the basis of oil in exchange of construction, of communication, railway, schools, everything that electricity, everything that Iraq needs immediately. And you will give in exchange the oil. And we can rely on Russia to arm the security forces, particularly after the experience of Iraq in 2014, when Obama failed to deliver the already paid weapons to Iraq, when ISIS was occupying city after city until it reached a third of Iraq. And the American thought that this is it, the country is going to be divided, and that is suitable for us. And this is where Iran jumped in. So today, Iran can sell missiles, can sell its own weapons. And we saw how efficient are Iranian missiles. We saw how efficient are the Russian Air Force jets in Syria. And we see that the Chinese technology and the Russian military equipments can support Iraq, and already Iraq is using the electricity from Iran. So an alternative exists, not as rich as what the American can provide with their partners. However, the cost of staying in Mesopotamia is very high on Iraq's stability, because the Americans refer to the Iraqi authority mainly when talking about Kurdistan. And they're not going to divide Iraq because they can't do it, because Iran and Turkey will jump on them and will make sure that this plan will fail and will surround Kurdistan and will strangle the economy of Kurdistan. And the Americans can't do much about it. However, when they stay in Iraq, they say, we talked about the Kurdish people, with the Kurdish people, we talked about the Sunni, and we talk with a part of the Shia that want us to stay. But this part of the Shia, the Sunni and the Kurds, represent less than half of the parliament. And the majority, as the parliament is based on democracy, the majority is for the exit of the US forces, no matter what the cost is.
I noticed in a tweet today that you mentioned Muqtada al-Sadr. And so this side deal was done with the prime minister. The prime minister, and with the support of al-Sadr. Is that how it went?
Well, Mustafa al-Kazemi came with the support of Muqtada al-Sadr and Sayyid Ammar al-Hakim, but circumstances led to his selection because of the assassination of the Brigadier General Qasem Soleimani. And because Soleimani was assassinated and Soleimani was trying to find a suitable personality that is accepted by both the Americans and the Iranians. And the Iraqis were very difficult about who to nominate because everybody wants to become a prime minister. And Mustafa al-Kazemi's name was proposed to, was on the table and discussed by the Iraqi leaders in October 2020, but was put on the side because he has an intelligence service background, although he's not that expert in intelligence because his real background is a journalist and not a very good journalist. He was just one of the favorite personage of Haidar Abadi, who selected him and put him on that position. But I mean, he was a moderate kind of a personality that is accepted by the Americans, that is accepted by the Iranians, that the Iraqis who want to become prime minister also accepted him because they all want to be prime minister and they all refuse each other. And because he was not on the table among the hot choices, but he was on a cold choice, so he was pulled back and he was nominated. And who is supporting him is Muqtada Sadr for simple reason, because Muqtada got everything he wants from the government, all the ministers he wants, the embassies, the ambassadors he wants, the general directors of several ministries. So he is the one holding the main power. And also when there are people in the street, demonstrator, Muqtada sent his thugs in the street and they killed few people and they asked the others to leave or they make sure that nobody stays in the street. So because he is ready to use violence and he has power to do it, he's not afraid to clash with any other party. Then Muqtada is behind al-Kazemi and Muqtada is against giving an idea that the government of al-Kazemi is weak and can't hold back the resistance.
That's interesting.
And because he's not part of the resistance, he's not someone who wants to put his people to fight the Americans in the street, even if he did that in 2004, 2005, until 2010.
Does he still enjoy a lot of popular support as well?
Yes, he enjoys the support particularly among the poor population in the south of Iraq and also in the Sadr city in Baghdad, which is significant, and all that he has inherited from his father.
Yeah. Now, the Iraqi parliament, you hinted that they were not going to agree to this escalation. And just now when we were talking, you think that NATO may change their mind about it. Do you think that the Iraqi parliament is going to take some action, or are they just going to remind NATO about that they already agreed to call for withdrawal of the troops, or will it be done in the back rooms? Do you think that there'll be something publicly done? Has a statement been issued disagreeing with it, or would they take further action via the parliament to demand withdrawal or anything like that?
Several members of the parliament already spoke against the NATO decision and saying this is not in the right of NATO to take such a decision. And the parliament has already issued a binding verdict on the expulsion of all foreign forces. The parliament will make sure to remind the government of the necessity to implement this. And if the parliament is not awake enough to do so, the Iraqi resistance is doing the rest. And the Iraqi resistance will increase its attack. And I can promise you that from now until the end of the year, we will see dozens and dozens of attacks against the US bases.
Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of. I noticed that there's an article in the Military Times yesterday, that says the Pentagon is not yet placing blame for the 3 rocket attacks on Iraq bases housing U.S. troops. Attacks on Baghdad's Green Zone, Balad Air Base, and Erbil International Airport in the past week are all under investigation. Pentagon spokesman John Kirby told reporters Monday after Iraq officials told the Associated Press that one rocket fell within the perimeter of the vast U.S. Embassy complex. Another fell in a nearby neighborhood. So here's the quote. It's difficult to say with certainty whether there's a strategic calculation driving this recent uptick in attacks or whether this is just a continuation of the sort of attacks we've seen in the past, Kirby said. And they're saying, the Trump administration used hard rhetoric. They said they leaned hard into the Iranian-backed militias operating in Iraq. The Defense Department under Joe Biden has taken a more measured tone, waiting for investigators on the ground to complete their inquiries before calling out the perpetrator. So they keep, in a number of different articles, they keep saying that the Biden administration is not freaking out about this, is not denouncing anybody or making any threats. And I'm not quite sure why they are trying to put out this kind of reaction. But I thought that was interesting.
There are two issues here. The first is obviously Biden doesn't want a war in the first 100 days of him in power. And he's trying to avoid it, and he's trying to do that with Iran. He's not talking about Syria, doesn't want to do anything in Syria because there are no good option for the US. And he's not going to react on the Iraqi bombing of the base, Harir base in Kurdistan. What the Americans failed to remember is following the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes and their companion, Iran bombed not only Ain al-Assad, but bombed also two military bases in Kurdistan. And the message was that you're not going to be protected anywhere in Iraq. And the message to the Americans is don't think if you leave all the mainly Shia controlled area, all the Sunni area, you're going to get away with it when you go to Kurdistan. The rockets were fired within Kurdistan, in Kurdistan, by a car left very close to the base, and with a timer, and the timer was responsible for making sure that the people who put these rockets have enough time to leave and take a long distance between them and a car. And that means that the attack on the US base was made in Kurdistan, and it doesn't mean that Kurdistan is all pro-US, like it doesn't mean that the rest of Iraq is a pro-Iran. There is a decision for the Americans to leave. People accuse the Americans of manipulating the return of ISIS, and before that, the growth of ISIS, and particularly after General Mike Flynn report, who acknowledged that they saw ISIS growing and they saw ISIS taking more power and expanding to Syria, and will go to Syria and will control Mosul. And the Americans did nothing. And by failing to deliver weapons, it was a clear message from the Americans to the Iraqi that they don't want to divide the country. And because the Iraqis don't want to divide the country, because the Americans violated the rule of hospitality, because they did not respect the contract with the Iraqi government, that they cannot mount attacks on Iraqi security forces, because as per informed Abdel Mahdi when he was prime minister, that they're going to attack security forces on the border between Iraq and Syria, and he did, and killed 28 security forces officers, among Hashd al-Sha'bi, the federal police, army. They were all in the same place, and then bombed Karbala and bombed other positions in Jurf al-Nasr and other areas. That is a clear violation that the Americans are doing everything they want. and disrespecting the Iraqi sovereignty. And the day of the assassination, the US is allowed to have one drone in the sky, and this drone has a specific timetable that the Americans need to provide. So they put two drones in the sky all day, and they disregard the Iraqi calls of what they are doing in the sky in a non-authorized flight, and they ignore that. This is where the Iraqis are saying it is time for you to leave. If you pull the forces to Syria, that's okay. It is not the problem of the Iraqis. It becomes the problem of the Syrians. But if you pull forces to Kurdistan and you say in the US bases in Kurdistan, that it's still an Iraqi problem, and the Iraqis will look after the expulsion of the Americans from their country because they are respecting the law. This is the decision of the parliament, and they want to implement it.
Yeah. One of the things that Stoltenberg said was that not only are they going to increase the numbers of NATO troops, but they're going to expand the area. Now, one of the journalists asked, "Well, does that mean you're going to be looking for new bases?" And he kind of dodged that question, though he said something like, the bases aren't really the big issue here. But you're saying that as far as the Erbil, the base near Erbil Airport, that was to send a message that you can't just move everybody there to, you're not safe there either. I did wonder whether this increase in number of troops was really to be used in Syria. But I was surprised, and basically all of our assumption here has been that when Biden gets into office, the focus is going to be back on Syria, and the regime change operation is going to pick up again, and we're going to, there are going to be false flag chemical attack, that it felt like kind of just going back to 2015. But you had mentioned in your article, a recent article, that you don't think that Biden's focus is going to be Syria. And I was very curious about that.
Yes, because there are no good options for the Americans. There are all good options for the Syrian if the US withdrew from Syria, because the US is doing everything to prevent the economy from boosting and from recovering. And they're closing the border between Syria and Iraq. Therefore, if the Americans leave this border area of Al Tanf, it means Syria can recover. They are still occupying northeast Syria. And if they leave, it means the Syrian government can recover the oil field that represent 80% of the local consumption and 75% of the local need of agriculture. And if the Americans leave, it means Syria can recover that and can regain strength. We're talking about the Syrian population that is starving. The people in power never starve. They always can eat and can live well. It's in majority of the population. And this is a very old policy by government, particularly superpower like the US. They do everything in their power to make sure that the population will turn against the ruler. By starving the population, they think the population will turn against the ruler. This didn't happen in Afghanistan. It didn't happen in Iraq. It didn't happen in Iran. It didn't happen in Lebanon. And it's not happening in Syria. And it's not happening certainly in Venezuela, in Cuba, and in other countries. So starving population is not a good policy. However, the Americans still think it's a good policy. Therefore, they're not going to leave northeast Syria. Also, if they do that, they think they will leave it to the Russian to take over. And Biden declared Russian as adversary. He thinks the Russians are the enemy and the Chinese are competitors. So he's not going to leave northeast Syria to the Russian. Also, he has the Kurds, and there is the Kurds lobby that is saying you can't leave that to be massacred by the Turks. This is a false narrative, because if the US leaves northeast Syria, it is the Syrian government that is going to replace the American forces, and it is the Syrian army that is mainly made by Kurdish people that used to be deployed in the Kurdish area that is going to protect the borders. Now, there's something here I really need to mention. It's the attack of Turkey on the province of Afrin. There was a negotiation between the Syrian government and the Kurdish YPG. And the negotiation was, you have to deliver us the control of the province, and we will protect the borders, and we will prevent the Turk from advancing and occupying Afrin. And the YPG said clearly to the Syrian government, we can't do that because the Americans will not allow us. And they prefer to give Afrin to Turkey. And not only that, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, was able to link Afrin and Idlib together and have a very vast land under his control. And he took also part of Al-Bab, Jarablus, and moved toward the Kurdish area in the northeast. So the Kurds, YPG, and the Americans are responsible for the Turkish advance and occupation of part of Syria. So the Americans are not going to leave that, because what do? They want to leave and then reinforce the Syrian government. They want to leave and reinforce Turkey, or they want to give up on the Kurds, or they want to open the trade between Iraq and Syria, and they don't want all of that. So there are no options, and Biden is not going to become suddenly a benefactor and say, okay, I want Syria to prosper and I'm going to leave. He's not going to do that.
So some people are saying that as soon as Biden came into office, within days, there were more troops, American troops in Syria, and other people saying, no, that didn't happen. Was that true or not?
Last month, there were 50 trucks full of American forces crossed from Iraq to Syria. There is a reinforcement of forces in Syria, and there are more than 900 American troops in Syria.
But no increase in number, right? It was maybe it was just like a rotation or something, or
no. That's an increase of number, and the number is irrelevant here because they have air force that they can call upon in minutes and can stop any attack or any advance or any attempt to relocate the U.S. proxies or particularly the Syrian jihadist on the Tanaf under the name of Maghawir Thawra, who acts most of the time like ISIS and sometimes like smugglers, and they have so many other roles.
Oh, man. I have a question for you from my friend Kyle from the Conflicts of Interest podcast that we do Swapcast with sometimes. He says he'd like to know what's happening in northeast Syria, and with the U.S. support for the Kurds and Turkish-U.S. relations, which you just talked about. He said, for example, Turkey just hired a major U.S. lobbying firm to try to get back into the F-35 program. There were rumors that Turkey offered to take the Russian missile systems, and I guess put them in Azerbaijan or something like that in exchange for what? I have no idea what's going on with that. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, nothing of all that is happening because all these are rumors released by Turkey as a messages to attract the bee to the honey. So what Erdogan is trying to do is to attract Biden and saying, all options are open. I want a good relationship. So what can you offer me? And I am flexible on it. The S-400 are still under the Turkish control. The F-35 has been halted by the Americans, but not only that, the Americans hurted really severely the Turkish Air Force because they stopped selling all the spare parts, and most of the Turkish Air Force are made in the US. Therefore, the Turkish Air Force is in deep trouble. Uh, Erdogan is trying to negotiate to lift these sanctions imposed by Trump, and that Biden is taking advantage of and taking his time. He's not in a hurry. He's looking at his options, what are the best options for him to impose the best US policy over all the players in the Middle East and then decide. And among these are the lifting of sanctions on Turkey, and in exchange, what Turkey is ready to offer. He didn't even discuss that yet.
One last thing. I'm hearing again from Stoltenberg and just the buzz in the media. It's all ISIS, ISIS, ISIS again. Uh, we hadn't heard a lot about ISIS in the past few years. I'm wondering, well, I mean, I can guess what it's a justification for increasing a number of troops in Iraq, but also Idlib. What do you think that things will change in Idlib now?
I don't think the situation in Idlib is going to change until the Syrian presidential elections, because it is a very tough battle, and it can be done only by an agreement with Turkey. And Turkey has around 15,000 men in the area of Idlib and north of Idlib, Afrin and all the rest. And they're not going to leave. They have introduced the Turkish language at school. They've changed the books. They have their currency. They have a kind of a general consul that is acting as a governor. They impose their own understanding of the history of the Middle East over 5,000 schools in the north. And therefore, this is not going to be a military battle to liberate Idlib. It's going to be a negotiation. It's going to take some time. And today, the most important is to see what the Americans are going to do, because the Americans are more damaging on Syria than the Turks. Turkey is supplying Syria with what Syria needs. And sometimes, just to be honest here, some of the Iranian oil is smuggled into Syria via Turkey. But although the Kurds YPG sell some of their oil to the Syrian government, they sell some of their oil to Al Qaeda. They sell the oil to everybody. That's business on the side, like ISIS was selling to everybody. So there is no bonus to the YPG to say they are selling to the central government. So you see here, the Americans are preventing the really regaining of the Syrian economy, and they're much more dangerous on the Syrian economy than Erdogan. Once the Americans leave, then Erdogan's flank in the northeast will be completely open and vulnerable. And then with the presence of the Syrian army, then this is a big battle is going to happen, because in the Battle of Sarakib, we saw that 17 Turkish military posts were isolated inside the Syrian army that advanced beyond that, beyond the Turkish military bases and observation points, and they didn't care. So that is possible, that is feasible. You can't do that with the Americans. We saw what the Americans did in the mountain of Tharda in Deir ez-Zor when ISIS was attacking, and destroyed half of the Syrian army who were resisting against ISIS. And they did that in 5 hours. They have a very strong military power. But when Turkey threatened to attack the Syrian army, Russia said that the Syrian army is going to use the S-300 missiles, and they're going to retaliate and shoot down all the Turkish planes. So Turkish backed down and withdrew and renounced on the idea of attacking the Syrian army. You can't do that with the Americans. So the priority is the Americans here.
All right. Well, I should let you go. Well, anything? You're headed that way, so I assume you're going to hear a lot more information. Is there anything else that that you want to say before we wrap up, or what we should anticipate?
Do you want to talk about Israel and Syria, or Israel and Iran and Syria?
Yeah,
Or
sure.
you think that's not a topic that you would like to tackle now?
No, I'm always interested, uh, and always confused by what's going on. That's right. In your article about Syria, you mentioned that uh, the priority is just basically what Israel wants in terms of protection and the freedom to do what they want in Syria. Is that kind of true?
Well, basically, the Israelis are trying to provoke a war with the Syrian army, and they want the Syrian army to respond. And if the Syrian army responds, then the Israeli will destroy all the effectives of the Syrian army in in the country, because they want to do that and they can't find the excuse. So far, they are limiting themselves to saying we are carrying out preemptive attacks against missiles, which is not true. Not always. I mean, the last attack in Deir ez-Zor was not against missiles; was against equipments like Range Rovers, transport, and they use very sophisticated bomb that can burn all the inside and not destroy the building. So they know what they are doing, and they're trying to drag Iran and Syria to a confrontation, and Syria and Iran are not going to respond to Netanyahu, to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And they're going to accept the destruction of some of the material, and they're going to replace it with other, and they insist on doing that. And every time the Israelis destroy a building, they fill up 2 or 3 other buildings.
So I wasn't really aware of some of these things, recent occurrences. Um, has this been just recent since Biden came in, or are you talking about the?
No, that was the last attack on Deir ez-Zor and Al Qaim and Al Mayadin. They attacked 3 locations in a different location on the border and in Deir ez-Zor and around that area. And all these were material piled up by Iran in these places. And the Israelis said we destroyed missiles, and that is not true. They didn't destroy missiles, but they destroyed a large number of equipment, non-lethal equipment. However, Iran is aware of that and aware of the intention of Netanyahu to drag Iran and Syria to a war, and they're not going to respond to that, not now. Now the Syrian army is not thinking about confronting Israel and doesn't want to do that now, but it is going to do it sooner or later.
So if Israel provoked a war with Syria and Iran got into it, are they planning on fighting that war by themselves, or is that what their new alliances with the Gulf states are about? And wouldn't the Gulf states wouldn't they have a problem with that? Especially if Iran got pulled into it, wouldn't Iran then punish? I mean, what they've done before is they said, if you attack us, we're going to hit your allies in the Gulf region. Wouldn't that sort of like ignite all of that again, or could it be contained to just the area in Syria?
Look, we saw what money and U.S. military equipment can do in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates bought for tens of billions of dollars U.S. equipment. So they used a lot of money and built the best U.S. equipment, and they did not manage to defeat the Houthis. So people say in the West they are militant rebels, a group of people. I mean, this tiny group of people they try to diminish is responsible for more than 65% of the Yemeni population living under them. And it is not only took this capital Sana'a, but is also taking Ma'rib, where ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the Saudis and Hadi Mansour Abdrab is fighting with his people, and they're not managing. So we know now that the US equipments cannot allow a country to win a war. Money cannot allow a country to win a war. Therefore, I don't think the Gulf countries are going to be part of any future war. On the contrary, they are very afraid, but they are very much willing to finance. Like they have financed every single war starting from 1980, the war against the Soviet when they moved to Afghanistan. And they supported the Mujahideen and the Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, who later on turned against the Americans. So yes, the Saudis can finance wars, but they can't go into the war and can't participate to a war because they are too weak. Now, if Netanyahu starts a war against Syria, I think the whole axis will be involved. And if Netanyahu starts a war against Lebanon, the whole axis will be involved. Now it is not the time for the axis, and I'm talking about axis that means Gaza, Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, Tehran, and Sana'a, because also in Sana'a there are missiles that can reach Israel, and the Israelis are aware of that. And all the Iranian technology are in the hand of the Houthi, and I'm extremely happy for Iran to support the Houthi that are fighting against a whole coalition of the richest country in the world, Saudi Arabia and Emirates, and the most powerful country in the world, US, UK, Canada, Germany, France, with all their weapons. And one small rebel group, let's call them like that, because I like to minimize their size to say, well, this small, tiny group is defeating this very powerful coalition. Therefore, this small group is supported by only one country. Even Russia is against the Houthi. It's supported by Iran, and Iran and the Houthi are managing to push away all these powerful countries, and the Houthi will be part of any big war if it happens in the Middle East, and if Israel starts a war against one of these countries.
But let's go back to if Israel provokes a war with Syria. How would that play out? Like, to me, I get it's my own ignorance, I guess. I think if Israel provokes a war with any country in the Middle East, it's going to spread. They're going to pull us into it. If Syria, Iran's going to get into it, I don't know what happens with Russia at that point. I just don't see how it could stay contained to just Syria. Although I guess it has for a while now, but
I don't think the Israelis are going to provoke any war because the internal front, the domestic front, is extremely fragile and is not ready for war. Secondly, it is true that Israel is much better equipped today with more sophisticated and lethal weapons than back in 2006, the war in Lebanon. However, the entire axis of the resistance is also much better equipped. Hezbollah, Gaza, the Palestinian in Gaza, the Yemeni, the Syrian, the Iraqi, they all today have armed drones and they have precision missiles. Therefore, Israel is equipped and its adversaries are equipped. It is not going to be easy. Therefore, I don't think Israel is going to provoke a war. However, if Israel decides that it is in its best advantage to start with the weakest country, in this case, Syria, Syria is not going to be left alone. And the missiles, the precision missiles that are piled up in Syria, and well, I mean, the former Israeli defense minister said every 5 Iranian convoy, we destroy one. So four convoys are stockpiled somewhere. And these will be used against Israel in due course. And Syria will not be alone in this war. And I think Israel is very knowledgeable of that. This is why Netanyahu, who has a very smart team, is doing just hit and run attacks by hitting specific locations, specific targets that do not provoke a war.
Yeah, but I mean, the stockpiles still grow if they only get 1 out of 5. So I don't know. It's frustrating. It just feels like everything, and maybe this is the strategy. And if someone sets off a war, it can spread so far that everyone's afraid to spark a war. So I don't know. Maybe that's the only way to manage it right now. But it's hard to watch, and you know me, I don't want to be involved in this at all. So
I don't think there is going to be a war very soon. I think this year we're going to see how is the behavior of the Biden administration and how Biden is going to respond to the attacks in Syria, to attacks against his troop in Afghanistan, and the attacks against his troop in Iraq. So let's see in which direction the winds are going to blow, and to see how the reaction of the Biden administration, and if Biden is going to manage to create kind of stability domestically first, to be able to create a challenging situation for China to stand up to the China challenge and to cope with the Russian bear that is waking up after long hibernation and advancing in other areas in the Middle East and in other parts of the world. And if he's going to be able to stop Europe from supplying itself from the Russian gas, all that, the relationship with Turkey has a lot on his plate. So let's see, before he starts a new war, if he's going to entangle all these many problems and to solve some of these problems.
You know, there is one more thing I wanted to ask you about. In Biden's foreign policy speech, he said that they're going to completely stop any support for offensive attacks against Yemen, support of the Saudis. But then he said, and of course, those words can be manipulated, right? We don't know exactly what offensive attack is defined as. And at the same time, he said, but, we're also going to expand operations for the defense of Saudi Arabia. So it sounded to me like more deployments into Saudi Arabia. And I mean, the last time we did that didn't turn out well. So what do you think about that, or what are you hearing about that? The answer to the bonus question is in a bonus segment for patrons. You can get access to these. There's one for almost every interview by subscribing at Patreon. Plus, you get access to other patrons-only episodes, Q&A live streams and such, and the Discord channel where we can talk among ourselves. So that's my tease, and I hope that some of you will join us. I'll continue now with the interview wrap-up. Anyway, let me let you go, Elijah.
Okay.
Enjoy your trip, and please tell everybody where to find your work.
Thank you.
Tell everybody where to find your website and how to support your work.
So my articles are on my WordPress, and you just need to put Elijah J. Magnier, and then you find me. Please subscribe to my article. This is my source of income since COVID, and that will be a really good support. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Elijah Magnier. Follow Elijah on Twitter, EJMAlRai, that's EJMAlRai. Find and support his work at ejmagnier.com, where you can subscribe to his articles and donate. This podcast, independent media. Listener support, really important. Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire, PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. Find it on all the mobile podcast apps, on the website AroundTheEmpire.com, Patreon, on YouTube. If you're listening on YouTube, like, share, subscribe, and stay tuned for some new platforms coming soon, where you'll also be able to find Around the Empire. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody.